All right, I want to give a deep dive on scrap warping. So currently, CaveWhere, does this great warping. And one thing that you'll notice with really high angle shots, especially with plan scraps and also projected scraps, because it actually uses the same warping angle algorithm just at a different view angle. Really, a plan is just a projected profile. It's just that the slice is flat like this. So anyways, in CaveWhere, essentially what happens is, you put in your survey stations, and then what it does is, say, for example, if I wanted to warp this point right here, it will look at station 1, the distance to it, station 2, the distance to it, station 3, and then any other stations that are in the scrap. And the problem with that is, and then it kind of does like a weighted average, and that weight is based off of essentially this equation, which is 1 over x squared. So if you're really close to a station, then the position of that point is heavily weighted. So for example, if we go back to CaveWhere at station 1, if we go in the z direction, you can see that these points are really heavily weighted to station 1's position. And the same thing with station 2 and station 3. What's more interesting is kind of the data that's like further away from stations, and those points are essentially mixed between station 1, 2, and 3. And if you kind of get relatively far away from any one station, they kind of all just kind of average out. Now the problem with that is it kind of has a global sense. So if you look at this scrap, you can kind of see how like the fringes get pulled down by the lower stations. Like this fringe out here gets pulled down by these stations, and this fringe gets pulled up by station 1. And you can really see it because you kind of get this like whipsaw curve that's involved here, and that's not ideal. Like in reality, we kind of want this scrap to be hugging the survey line. So been doing a little work on this, and essentially I've added some ways to correct this, and I've actually made them default. So if we go into our preferences here, and in warping, now this is not the default settings. This is like the settings on what CaveWhere currently is. If you download it off CaveWhere.com, this is kind of what the warping you get right now. But in the future version, this is what you'd have. And there would be more defaults, which I would show you. So first off, the grid resolution. That's essentially how much CaveWhere tessellates this scrap to do the warping. So right now it's right now it's at 1 to 1 meter. So if you did something crazy like 10 meters, it would essentially make a grid point every 10 meters, and you can really see that like it's more choppy. You have this like big valley here, and of course if we go back and put this back to 1, and hopefully I can do that, you can see that it adds a lot more points in there and smooths that out. So that's essentially what the grid resolution does. So just to show off these other things that will be enabled by default, now there is something called shot interpolated spacing, and what this will do is essentially this will create basically dummy stations along the survey line, and right now, and that's happening every half meter. So you can actually see that in this jigsaw slice here. So it's trying to fit the stations down to the survey line. Of course, there's a lot of other data that it's kind of globally looking at. Like there's a lot of weight inside of this survey line that's kind of pulling everything else up around it. And it's not ideal, but you can see on these like horizontal shots, that whipsaw that we had is now kind of eliminated. It's more or less on that center survey line. But you can see the outer edges the survey is still kind of affected by 3, 4, and 5. So again, if we go back to this and we disable interpolation, you can see that it's no longer fitted on the survey station because we don't have these like demi shots that are running along the survey line. So we'll enable that and get us back to where we were. Yeah, fitting on the center line. That's great. Getting closer. You can also see here on the top, you still kind of have that like hat formation where the stations along the survey line are kind of pulling down the edges of this shot. Now, of course, when you're caving, in reality, if you're at station 3, you're really just like looking at kind of the walls around here. So really, you know, this should only be warped close to station 3, and all the data here shouldn't affect station 3. So if we go back to our settings, we can use max closest stations. When it's disabled, it looks at all the stations in the whole thing. By default, it's going to be at 10. So more or less, you can like multiply 10 by however much your station interpolation is. So this is kind of going to give you a rough like 5 meter lookup around the shots. Now, I know that was fast. If you look at it now, you don't have that kind of warping along the edges here that are pulling it up, and you kind of have more local warping around each individual station. Now, if you look at this one, that kind of hat is completely gone. This is more flat, and then of course these are pulled down closer to the stations at the bottom. So if we go back and I just turn this off and show you the difference. So that was what we had before. You know, things are getting pulled down, and if we enable it, things are kind of more locally morphed close to the stations. Now, if you kind of look at this, sometimes it can be pretty, with this 10 station lookup, it does pretty good at smoothing things out. But if we drop this down to 1 station, so essentially it's saying, okay, I'm going to look at the closest station and do the warping. When we enable that, you can see that there's a pretty distinct waterfall effect that you get. So for example, here it's saying, okay, I'm probably closest to this line over here, so I'm going to warp it to that. And down here, I'm going to warp it down to this station. And then you have basically these discontinuities. And of course, discontinuities don't look all that great, but it really forces the warping to go right next to the stations. So if we go back to this guy and we enable smoothing, this will essentially do a Gaussian smoothing curve on the whole thing, and it'll kind of smooth out that waterfall effect. So you can see that it's a little bit more smooth. One of the downsides to this is if you do too much smoothing, say if we bump this up to 20 times, and we take a look at what it looks like. When you do too much smoothing, essentially you lose all your elevation, because this is a kind of a it's also a global lookup. So you really want that smoothing to just happen really close to a single point. When it's too wide, when this is looking at 20 meters for the elevation, you know, it's looking all the way over here where the elevation is versus all the way over here. And it's going to get you that like flat average plane. That's not kind of what you want. So you want the smoothing to be pretty low. 2 meters is essentially only going to do a 2 meter lookup around a particular point. And of course, I think in general, having a little bit more stations to look at, maybe 5 or so, 5 to 10, kind of gives good results with the smoothing. So that's kind of what I've been working on, is just getting local warping going in CaveWhere on plan views. All right, till next time.